Before I get to the specific questions that were sent my way by email, in fact, one of them I'll address from the very beginning about the origins of the kibbutz. I'd like to start with the origins of the kibbutz and then move forward in time through the years. And Janine mentioned the book that I co-edited about the transition from yeshuv, or from a Jewish community, to state. And in fact, one of the documents that we have in this collection deals specifically with the formation of the first kibbutz in Gania. So to bring some expertise to this question, and I'll start with that and then move forward in time. But before we get to the actual creation of Gania, the first kibbutz, some background that I think will be useful. So when we talk about the Zionist movement and the idea of creating ultimately the state of Israel, of course the first thing that comes to mind are the political issues that the Zionist movement said from the very beginning, this idea of creating an independent Jewish state in Palestine. But the Zionist movement from the very beginning also had other goals in mind. For example, from the very beginning, the Hebrew language was a major cause of the Zionist movement, and from the very first Zionist congresses, the question of culture and language were prominent. But another issue that was featured prominently very early on from the Zionist writings, and then as the Zionist movement became a political movement and an actual pioneering movement, is the issue of Jewish work or Jewish labor, which was paramount among Zionist thinkers from the very beginning. And it was crucial to them on a host of levels. One, it had to do with their perception of Jewish history. And they felt that they were rebelling not only against the nations or the empires that oppressed the Jews for centuries and brought about anti-Semitism and persecution, but they were also rebelling against Jewish history itself and the type of society or societies and communities that Jews developed over the years as a result of the fact that they were living in exile under foreign rule. And one of the things that they highlighted in their criticism of what became of Jewish society was the fact that Jews were disengaged from labor. Now they said that the Jews were not necessarily responsible for this historical condition. It was the countries in which they lived and the type of restrictions that they faced. For example, in medieval, early modern Europe, Jews were not allowed to own land or work the land. So they were prevented from entering the agricultural cycle from the beginning. They were not allowed to join professional guilds. So there were restrictions that they faced, and so they were brought into different communities to provide certain economic services, money lending, later on trade and banking. So they were in a way forced into these fields, but also Jewish communities, partly because of the isolation or the segregation, also placed great emphasis, for example, on Jewish education, whereby an overwhelming number of Jewish males engaged in study for the sake of study and did not engage in labor to support the community or their families. And this is something that the Zionists were very keen on changing from the very beginning. So they emphasized the idea that the national revolution would also include a cultural and social revolution, whereby labor and manual labor and returning to the land and working the land would take a prominent place in their thinking and their ideology. And if you read all the early Zionist texts from the second half of the 19th century, you see that the idea of labor and capturing labor and returning to the land through labor was crucial. And so, when Zionists started to turn Zionism from an idea into a reality in the early 1880s, in what we call the first Aliyah, or the first wave of Jewish migration, these ideas were inspiring the early pioneers. And they indeed wanted to go to Palestine, mainly from Eastern Europe, in order to create a new society that would be based on Jewish labor, that will be self-sufficient, and would celebrate those values. In fact, if we look at the first Aliyah in the 1880s, they still didn't think in political terms. They didn't have a conception of a future Jewish state at that time. For them, it was just too far in the future at that point. You'd have to wait for Herzl about 15 years later to formulate a more cohesive political plan. But they were very keen on changing Jewish communities and Jewish society from the core, and this was the reason that they went to Palestine. Now, these members of the first Aliyah were not the first Jews to go from Europe to Palestine, or the Holy Land. Jews have been going from Europe to the Holy Land for centuries. In fact, throughout the 19th century, several thousand Jews made the Aliyah, pilgrimage, from Eastern Europe to Palestine. But most of them were Hasidic Jews, who came for mainly religious, messianic reasons. And when they came to the Holy Land, they tended to settle mainly in Jerusalem, but in the other holy cities or old cities. So Hebron, Tiberias, Tzfat, these were the center. And they were not interested in creating new communities. They went to study Torah and mainly to die in the Holy Land, which was one of their ideals. So when the time comes, they'll be closer to where resurrection might take place. The Zionists, when they started coming in the 1880s, and they were members of organizations such as Chibat Zion, Lovers of Zion, or Bilu, they had a different concept in mind. They didn't want to go and settle in the old established towns. They wanted to create new agricultural communities where they could bring into practice this new ideology. And indeed, they came. And they established a few agricultural communities in Palestine. Zion, Yaakov, Shmina, and others. And they wanted to be Hebrew farmers in the ancient Holy Land. They were very keen on doing it. Do you know what happened to their experiment?
They became the bosses and not...
Yes, they soon became the bosses. First they failed miserably. Because soon they realized that they didn't know how to be farmers. They didn't realize what the conditions would be like in Palestine. And they were just not ready for the experiment. So they failed, and their communities basically went bankrupt. Most of them left. Some abroad, some to the cities of Palestine, and very few stayed behind. So, if they fail, went bankrupt, who do you go out for help? Not Hirsch. You go to the Rothschild family, which was the wealthiest Jewish family at the time. So their idea was to negate Jewish history. They ended up replicating decades and centuries of existing Jewish practices. So they went to the Rothschild family, especially the French branch of the family, which had various investments in the country even before they came. And the Rothschild family said, okay, we'll help you out. Now, what connection does the Rothschild family have with agriculture, if anything?
Wine.
Absolutely, yes. They own some of the best wineries in France, in Bordeaux, and they had some of the best experts in the field working for them. So they decided that they will basically buy out those failed experiments in Palestine, and they will send their own experts to run them and manage them. And this is what happened. So until this very day, the two centers of the Israel wine industry are Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov, still the legacy of the Rothschilds establishing wine industry there. But the changes that they created were important. So they brought their managers, and the managers realized that the Jewish farmers weren't very good. So the solution was hire farmers who knew how to work this specific land, meaning local Arab farmers. So this whole idea of Hebrew labor failed. What to do with the Jews who remained in those colonies? They became kind of the managerial class. So there was a clear hierarchy. The Arab Gentiles were the poor laborers actually engaging in manual work in the field, the Jews running things, and the non-Jewish experts controlling things from behind. So this became ultimately the reality of the first Aliyah, but things will change, and they will change quite dramatically when the second Aliyah started arriving after 1903. And this was a different social group of Zionists. While the members of the first Aliyah tended to be older, some of them came with families, they tended to be either religious or traditional. The members of the second Aliyah tended to be much younger. They tended to be overwhelmingly male, single, young, very secular, and socialist. So they were socialists, a unique brand of socialists who were both Zionists and socialists. Most of the other Jewish socialists in Eastern Europe rejected their synthesis of nationalism and socialism, but they created this synthesis and they created interesting justifications. They said, no, we're true socialists, we believe in social equality, we will fight for it. But because the Jews lived in abnormal conditions in the diaspora, first they have to liberate themselves nationally. And once they do that, then they can establish a society that will live up to the ideals of socialism as articulated by Marx and other socialist thinkers throughout the 19th century. And if you read some of the early texts of those socialist Zionists, they were classic Marxists. They wrote in classic Marxist language, class struggle, capitalist oppression, all the terms that were used in the 19th century, they adopted and used in their writings. And so they came and they wanted to now carry forward with the Zionist mission. But there was a clash between the new arrivals and the already established veterans of the first Aliyah who lived in those established agricultural colonies and were beginning to have a somewhat comfortable life in the system that developed. And there was a very strong clash between the two groups because the members of the second Aliyah insisted on Hebrew labor, on conquering Jewish work. And for them, first Aliyah was a failure. So they wanted to push ahead with their ideology. And they wanted to emphasize the role of Jewish labor. And they wanted to create trade unions. And they wanted to create communities that would reflect their socialist values. But there was also reality on the ground. They had to work within the framework of the Zionist movement. They had to rely on the Zionist movement chiefly for funds. They needed the money raised by the JNF in order to purchase land, to purchase machinery, to train. They couldn't just do it by themselves. So they had to negotiate and somewhat compromise with the existing reality on the ground, but the tensions were there, and the Zionist organization appointed Arthur Rupin to be the kind of the mediator between the members of the first Aliyah and the young guns who came in the second Aliyah and were eager to leave their mark on the land. And Rupin, as the head of the Land of Palestine office, tried to accommodate both groups, and one of the compromises was that his office with the JNF would create training farms that would be independent of the older colonies that were run by the Rothschild administration and the Jewish managerial class and hired Arab workers. And these will be training farms that will be exclusively Jewish, based on Hebrew labor, where they would have greater autonomy, but still in relationship with the Zionist administration. And one of the chief negotiators for the members of the second Aliyah was a young activist by the name of David Ben-Gurion, who was speaking on behalf of the workers. And the compromise was agreed, and they created this training camp in Juni, in the southern part of the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret. But then Arthur Rubin surprised the members of the second Aliyah, the trainees, because he sent as the administrator of the farm one of the French agricultural experts that the Rothschild family brought in the 1890s. And this was like a red flag for the members of the second Aliyah. I mean, for them it was just unacceptable. No way that they would cooperate and work with a non-Jewish member of this old oppressive administration. And they went on a series of strikes and work stoppages, classic tactics of the workers' movement. And they basically split from the Palestine office and created their own independent group, or kfutza. And this would soon become the first kibbutz. So it was out of this conflict with the older members of the first Aliyah over those values of Jewish labor and independence from the Zionist administration, which they felt caved in to the demands of the established colonies and the kind of economic considerations on the ground, that this very small group split out of this training camp and created their own kibbutzah, and they wanted to act independently, to be self-sufficient, and no longer to rely on the Zionist administration or any outside body for their existence or well-being. And this set forward the template that would emerge as the kibbutz. A few years for them to kind of find out and negotiate conditions on the ground and work it out. Of course, in the middle of everything came the First World War, where the majority of the Jewish community, the Zionist Jewish community in Palestine, had to be evacuated out of Palestine and into Egypt. One of the reasons that none of them took Ottoman citizenship when they came to Palestine. So they maintained their foreign nationality. And the majority of them were Russians. Russia, until 1916, was the enemy of the Turks in the war. So they were foreign patents, enemy, whatever the definition was. So they were exiled from Palestine into Egypt, which was under British control during the First World War. So all these social experiments and developments were put on hold during the First World War. When the war ended and the British conquered Palestine, the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate, they could return and reignite their social experiments, and at this point the kibbutz would develop and spread from Ganya to other experiments. So this is one element of the equation. The other element is that not every member of the second Aliyah wanted to join the kibbutz, believed in the idea of the kibbutz. Many of the members of the second Aliyah were more in the kind of the Leninist tradition of party organizing. And chief among them would be Ben-Gurion. They believed in a strong national party, in making an influence in the big established communities. They were not utopians in their worldview. They wanted a mass movement. But there were some who believed in the smaller community where you could exercise perhaps a more pure form of socialism. There would be some interesting debates between those who joined the kibbutz movement and those who decided not to join the kibbutz movement and work on the more national level. And here we have to touch on another interesting stream that existed in the Zionist movement from the very beginning. If you look at some of the texts that some of the early Zionist thinkers started writing in the 1880s, utopian novels was one of the most popular forms of Zionist writing. They published several utopias in the 1880s and 1890s in which they imagined a future society. And they contemplated only what future technology might look like, but also various social forms and structures. Now, they did not invent the utopian form of writing or thinking. This is a long-held tradition, and throughout the 19th century, we have a long tradition of socialist utopian writing. And many of the socialist utopian writers imagined small type of communities that will be self-sufficient and kind of detach themselves from the rest of society. One such example would be Charles Fourier, the French socialist thinker in the early part of the 19th century, who imagined the phalanx as a utopian society. He decided there would be, I think, 512 members in the phalanx, exact number, because it meets the number of emotional faculties that human beings have. So if you have a correlation between the number of people and the emotional faculties, you have a harmonious society, and in it people will work with whatever meets their emotional needs and psychological needs and other such developments, utopian society. And then people read Charles Fourier and wanted to actually try out some of those communal structures. They actually tried them in this country, in New Jersey, the 1830s and 1840s. They last about 10, 15 years before they dissolved as a social experiment. But these experiments were out there. And so when the Zionists started writing utopian novels, they were influenced by this socialist utopian tradition. They did not invent it. Even Herzl, his most famous book is Ad Neuland, which is a utopian novel, which he imagined what a future society in Palestine might look like in the year 1923. And if you read Ad Neuland carefully, there's a long speech by the main character, that Friedlander, in which he lists the entire history of utopian writing. So clearly Herzl was well versed in utopian writing and the various models and experiments that went on. So it was not new to the Zionists, all those theories that circulated in Europe throughout the 19th century. So again, they did not invent things. They borrowed certain ideas that were out there, but they implemented them into the Zionist context and the Palestinian context. And so all those ideas of independent Jewish labor and rebelling against Jewish history and bringing a fusion between Zionism and socialism, all those things found their way into the thinking that brought about the creation of the kibbutz. And if we look at it almost at the abstract, then kibbutz, at least in theory, was the purest form of socialist Zionism. Because if we look at the ways of life that developed in the kibbutz from the very beginning, the key principle was what? For life in the kibbutz, work was crucial, but even next to work, radical equality. But what was lacking in the kibbutz, which was a radical departure from
Religion.
yes, they were very secular. Property, no private property. This was crucial to the kibbutz from the very beginning. There was no idea of individual private property. Nothing. So you didn't own your home. You didn't own your land. You didn't eat at home. You ate communally, so you didn't have to purchase food to bring home. You didn't own your clothes initially. They were owned communally, so you use your clothes, you send them out to be washed, and then you picked up whatever you needed the next day or the next week. It wasn't yours. Nothing was yours, including the most radical conclusion of this lack of private property. Because, for example, if we look at the writings of Marx and Engels, what is the first form of private property in human society? This is where the word proletarian comes to us from. Children. Children are the private property of their parents. This is where the word proletarian comes to us from Roman history. People who only had children as their only contribution to society were described in Rome, in ancient Rome, as proletarian. They brought their children to the workforce. This is where the Marxists later on borrowed the term from. But Marx and Engels tell us that the first form of private property in human culture and society were children. They were owned by the parents, and we know the ancient society. But we can argue until this very day, the issue of the family and relationship between parents and children have also economic dimensions, especially if you think of the agricultural society. In the kibbutz, from the very beginning, the idea was that the parents don't own their children. They have no ownership over the children. And therefore, as soon as the child was born, it was taken away from the parents and was raised collectively. Now, the ties could not be broken completely, but it was severed fairly dramatically. And in some kibbutzim, all the way up to the 1970s. In some, not all. But initially, this was the idea, to break the nuclear family, which was, for them, the highest manifestation of middle-class ideology and private property. So you don't own anything. What else you couldn't find on a kibbutz? Within the kibbutz itself? Money. There was no money in the kibbutz itself. There was no function for money. There was no function for exchange. Because even if you had money, there was nothing to do with the kibbutz itself. Because again, you couldn't buy anything, because you couldn't own anything. So there was no money. So all the characteristics that we tend to associate with middle-class capitalist society as it emerged from the 16th century onward. In the kibbutz, heavily influenced by kind of utopian socialist thinking, they rebelled against it. So this was a truly revolutionary and radical idea that attempted to address every aspect of life and existence. So not only the nuclear family was broken, with the relationship between parents and children, the idea was also to try and do away with traditional gender roles, at least ideologically. Meaning women and men were completely equal in all aspects. In the workforce, in managing the kibbutz, in running, in whatever. Now I'm saying this was ideologically stated. The reality never quite matched the aspirations when it came to breaking traditional gender roles. If we look at the history of the kibbutz from the very beginning, even in the most radical kibbutzim, those who raised the kids in the communal children home were women. Those who ran the laundry rooms from the very beginning were women, and those who worked predominantly in the kitchen were women. Men tended to take more physical jobs.
I'm trying to get a sense of the timeline.
So this is from the very beginning in Ghana from 1911, and then in the 1920s. So the ideology called for radical gender equality. There was consensus that it was needed. The reality never matched the level of at least conscious commitment. I would also say that if you look at utopian writings from the very beginning, and again I will point to Fourier and others who came in his wake, they were the forefathers of the counterculture and the sexual revolution of the 1960s. For them, part of their ideology was to rebel against sexual norms, conservative sexual norms, and they preached for it. So free love, no longer marriage, this was part of their ideology. And at least some of the kibbutzim fully embraced those ideas, while in many of them they continued to have the institution of marriage, meant different things in different kibbutzim. This idea of a sexual revolution was very much part of the spirit of the kibbutz. And even their opponents in the 1920s and 1930s sometimes ridiculed them, criticized them, and it was something that the Orthodox Jews in Palestine and into Israel until this very day is something that created a fundamental gap between them and kind of the Zionist left that until this very day they could not overcome. We can think of certain sayings that Rabbi Shach said vis-a-vis the kibbutzim, that they eat rabbits and do other things like rabbits too. Viewed in kibbutzim. So again, this is part of the cultural legacy that they have. So on the one hand, there were the ideals, the aspiration to live up to those ideals. And certainly for labor Zionists, the kibbutz came to symbolize what Zionism was all about. They were the model. If you saw posters that were sent out from Palestine in the 1930s to raise money for the Jewish National Fund, you would imagine that 85% of the Jews lived in the kibbutz. This was the symbol. If you saw documentary films that were filmed in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in Israel, again, at least 80% of Israelis, you would think, lived on a kibbutz, because they figured so prominently. They were the advertisement of what Zionism was all about. And they were presented to the world and to the rest of the Jewish society in Palestine as a success story. This is a self-sufficient society that's based on the highest values of independent Jewish labor. But there was always an issue with it. Because while on the kibbutz itself you didn't need money, the kibbutz as an entity interacting with the rest of the world needed money. They had to live in the real world. They weren't completely self-sufficient. Now, luckily for them, from the 19 teens onwards, the dominant political force in Zionist politics, and later on in Israeli politics, was the labor movement. And they controlled the Zionist movement and organization. So they controlled the funds and the levers of power. And they controlled the Histadut, the Federation of Labor Unions, which is one of the most incredible inventions of the 20th century. It was a federation of unions, which was also the biggest employer in the society. So it was both the employer and the representative of the workers. Now this makes sense. Figure it out. Of course, the first secretary of the Histadut was Ben Gurion, so it's a classic Ben Gurion creation. But it meant that the Labor Party controlled basically every aspect of the economy and of society. So they controlled the biggest companies, like the biggest construction company, Nuva, which was the biggest distributor of produce and food in the country, the biggest bank, Solen Monet is the biggest construction. So they had the economic power, and they also represented the workers. And the kibbutzim were, of course, affiliated and part of the labor movement. So ultimately, they can always rely on the movement to fill in the gaps. So the members of the kibbutz never really felt the pressures of the economy outside of the kibbutz. They were very much protected or shielded from the ups and downs, or the ebbs and flows of the real market that existed outside the walls of the kibbutz. They were protected from it. So while internally they lived up to those ideals, when it came to interacting with the rest of society, there were bailouts now and then provided by those in power that helped various kibbutzim. So if the yield one year wasn't great, the kibbutz could survive. If you were a private farmer, you'd go bankrupt. You could lose it. So the private farmers who remained from the first Aliyah were subject to ups and downs and the realities of the market. The kibbutzim were protected. Now I told you that the emphasis in the kibbutzim was on labor and on agriculture. And in fact, the first kibbutzim were agrarian communities. There was, in the 1920s, an attempt to bring the spirit of the kibbutzim to the cities, to the emerging cities of Palestine. And this was Gduda Avoda, the labor brigade, which was created by the labor movement in the 1920s. And the idea was to create kibbutz-like communities in the urban centers. So to build new neighborhoods or new towns in the vicinity of other urban centers that would be based on the values of the kibbutz and Hebrew labor and so on and so forth. Some of them were successful, but they ended up integrating into the existing cities. The labor brigade tended to be even more radical than the kibbutzim in their kind of socialist interpretation. And some of them split and became arch-communists, and they ended up leaving Palestine and moving back to the Soviet Union and building cities there. They disappeared by the late 1930s. Literally disappeared. We don't know what happened on the stop.
You're talking about the urban kibbutz model disappeared by the...
No.
I'm sorry, who...
Literally those who left Palestine because they felt that the rest of the
people
labor
disappeared.
movement was not communist enough. They moved to the Soviet Union. They were welcomed by the Soviet Union. They were allowed to create their own communities in the Soviet Union. And then...
okay, thanks.
Literally, off the face of the earth.
What do you think happened?
One of the gulags. They didn't fit the party line. When it changed on March 7th, 1932, because you never knew what the party line is going to be the next second. Always have to adjust in retrospect what the new party line was. They were seen probably as revisionist, not following the right interpretation. So the kibbutzim grew and continued to expand. At the height before 1948, about 5% of the Jewish population in Palestine lived on kibbutzim.
That's all?
Hmm?
That's all?
That's all, 5%.
In 48?
By 1948, the peak in kibbutz population would be in the mid-1950s, about 7% of the overall population. So, again, somewhat minor, but their place in Jewish society pre-1948 and then after 1948 in Israel far exceeded their actual numbers in the population. So if you look at the leadership of the labor movement, heavy representation, kibbutz members. If you look at the fighting forces before 1948, after 1948, large representation for kibbutz members. So if you look, for example, at the elite units of the IDF in the 1950s and 1960s, the number of pilots, the number of the elite commando units, kibbutzim had well over 50% representation in those units. So far exceeding the place in the overall population. So in this regard, they left a mark that was bigger than their actual size population. Yes.
You mentioned what they were trying to do in the cities, but I don't remember hearing what actually developed.
Nothing much developed. The experiment kind of fizzled over time. What they did is they built actual neighborhoods in cities, which we have until this very day. So the physical impact is there, but the idea of creating those neighborhoods as kibbutz-like entities,
Meaning they would work
evaporate.
without money and they would have all of the.
yes, it
funds.
just kind of over time lost its energy and disappeared, yes. But the physical legacy is still there today. So we built actual neighborhoods. But, and then some of the more charismatic leaders of the labor brigade left to the Soviet Union. They felt that their comrades were not radical enough in the commitment to socialism. Perhaps were enjoying city life too much, deviating from the strict ideology. So that experiment ultimately failed. I noticed that one of the questions that you sent me had to do with the issue of land ownership. So I would like to address this. So up until 1948, basically all the Jewish communities in Palestine were built on JNF purchased land. There was no other way around. There was no Israel. There was no independent state of Israel. Palestine was either under the control of the Ottomans or under the control of the British. So if you wanted to own land, you had to purchase it and register it with the either Ottoman authorities or the British authorities. There was no other way around it. And so what the Zionist movement did until 1948, it raised money and it purchased land in Palestine. This is what they did. And by 1948, they owned about 13% of the land in Palestine was owned by Jewish communities, by the JNF, and other organs.
Sorry, what year was that?
What?
What year was that?
Up until 1948, up until the creation of the state. Once the state was created, everything changes. Because now there's the independent state of Israel. No longer the British or the Ottomans. And so you had people who lived Jews who lived in Palestine before 1948, and they continued to live on the land that they owned before 1948. So no change there. But there was a lot of new land now under the control of the state. And there were two sources of land. One, land that the British controlled, military bases, other functions that were under British control. This was now under the control of the state of Israel. And vast areas that used to belong to Arabs who became refugees as a result of the 1948 war. and under various laws that the Israeli Knesset passed in the 1940s and early 1950s, this became state-owned land, which was then leased over to the JNF. In complicated ways, if you can understand the logic behind, not the logic is clear, but if you can understand the legal system that controls land ownership in Israel, good luck. It's one of the most complex issues that we have with us until this very day. Because you know that most Israelis, when they own an apartment or a house, don't own the land on which they live. They actually technically own the lease over the land from the JNF. So what's out there in the market is not the land itself, but the right to the lease over the land. It is that the Jewish National Fund,
Who
the
owns
Jewish
the
people
land?
own the, what?
Who owns the land? The state?
Okay.
The state owns the government,
Yes.
owns the land?
Well, yes, but then the state uses the JNF as an organ to lease the land. So it won't violate any laws.
Everybody knows JNF is the Jewish National Fund. Or in case you didn't know, it's the Jewish National.
So areas that you live on are mostly, about 98% are controlled by the Jewish National Fund. Only about 2% are privately owned by Israeli citizens. In the Jewish sector, the Arab sector. But last, huge areas of land used to belong to Arabs, they became refugees, and under the absentee laws, they have no longer any rights over this land. So this became state land that then could be used by the state for various purposes. And the state did many things. They built new towns, development towns, other projects. They also built kibbutzim after 1948. And some of these kibbutzim were built over land that used to be Arab land. So, for example, if you take Kibbutz Megiddo, it was built right over the Arab village that existed there until 1948, Haji. So, after 1948, it was no longer the question of purchasing land through the JNF. It was now the state of Israel controlling the land and deciding how to allocate it. And after 1948, there was a mass wave, the initial mass wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine, of Holocaust survivors who were in displaced persons camps in Europe. They came, the country had to absorb them. One of the ways to absorb was to create new communities. Some of them were kibbutzim. So new kibbutzim were created in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And they helped in the absorption, mainly of those European Jews who were Holocaust survivors. Came in the late 40s and early 1950s. Part of the criticism and some of the social tensions that we have until this very day surrounding kibbutzim started when the second major wave of immigration to Israel started in the early 1950s, this time not of European Jews, but of Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries, Mizrahi Jews. They were not absorbed by the kibbutzim. Some, but not many of them. To become a member of the kibbutz, you have to be accepted to the kibbutz. And you have to undergo a period of, first of all, initially, the kibbutz has to approve you, then you go a period of probation, and then there are special committees that judge your candidacy and then approve your membership in the kibbutz.
You know, that kind of reminds me of a co-op in Manhattan.
Absolutely. Or a country club, yeah.
Yes.
Or a sorority.
Or,
Well, yeah, but, yeah.
But how does that work with equality for the vaccine?
well, again, the equality works beautifully inside the kibbutz, where the kibbutz deals with the outside world issues. So, the kibbutzim remained almost exclusively Ashkenazi, even when those major waves of immigration came, and the country undertook a massive social task of absorbing hundreds of thousands of immigrants who came. The kibbutzim played a limited role in this absorption. Their schools did help in educating immigrants who came. They offered kind of boarding school condition, but when it came to membership, it became a lot more difficult. So they remained very Ashkenazi until the very end, the kibbutzim. But you can also ask the question, why only Jewish? If the ideal is equality, Why not accept Arab members? This was never on the table with the kibbutz. From the very beginning, these were Jewish agricultural settlements. So again, equality inside. When it comes to the outside, somewhat less so.
It looked to me like the line of equality moved depending on how convenient it was or what they believed, right?
I don't know if it's a question of convenience. It's the idea that you can exercise this utopian ideology within a certain size of a community. And you can hope or try to maintain those values within this community. Again, I will point you back to Fourier, thought the 512 would be the number. Can you take care of 1 million people in an urban setting and live up to those ideals? Perhaps more difficult. Because living on a kibbutz also it was utopian in its outlook, but you needed to make some incredible sacrifices. You had to work where the kibbutz told you to work. If you wanted to be a poet, they said, okay, you work in the field for 12 hours, write poetry in your own free time. If you want to dress in a certain way, good luck. These are the clothes that we have. You're not happy with blue? Hope that gray is clean the next day.
What happened?
So individualism, also, so they made a lot of sacrifices. They gave up a lot of their kind of individual desires and wants and needs. We'll get to it. But those tensions were there from the very beginning. So they made incredible sacrifices to live up to those ideals of equality. So let's not dismiss it as issues of mere convenience. So there were a lot of sacrifices that were involved as well. And many of them lived a very hard life. They were very committed. Even if they were not hugely successful, still, they made incredible sacrifices and gave up a lot in order to live up to those ideals. And it was incredibly taxing. Then, the state used kibbutzim for another function. One of the branches of the IDF is the Nachal, Noah Chalutzi Lochem, a pioneering fighting youth. And the idea behind the Nachal was that you take mostly urban youth, they join the military, but as part of their service, they spend some of the time working on an existing kibbutz, but then a substantial chunk of the time building new settlements, communities, and many of them turned into kibbutzim in the 1950s and 1960s. And here the state basically used the kibbutz movement for its own purposes. There were new borders. Most of those borders were empty, so there were no settlements along the borders. For example, the border between Israel and Egypt, in the middle of the desert, there were no Jewish communities along most of this border. The state felt that it was important to have civilian presence along the border. The way to do it, use the Nachal. Send them. Create various forms of settlement so there will be civilian presence along the borders. And it was true in the Jordan Valley, up along the northern border. So again, the state here used them and used the pioneering spirit of the kibbutz to advance its own kind of political, social ends and needs. And in many ways, the kibbutz fit perfectly into this overall scheme of things. So, after 1948, the question of land ownership becomes more complicated and much more dependent on the state for allocation of land. Now this would become even more trickier after 1967. Because in fact, the first settlements that the state of Israel built in the Sinai, in the Golan Heights, and in the West Bank and the Jordan Valley were Nachal Kibbutzim. And this led to some very interesting conflicts within the kibbutz movement. The parts of it tended to be very leftist and very much opposition to holding on to those territories. Though other parts of the kibbutz movement were fine with it and believed in expanding the mission to these newly acquired territories. So this led to some interesting rifts within the kibbutz movement. So we know the end. The end is today, where we basically don't have the kibbutz in the form that it was created back in the 1910s and 1920s. There are kibbutzim in name, but they're not anything like existed before. You eat at home, you raise your kids, many of them now own their homes on the kibbutz, you buy your clothes in the shopping mall. It's kibbutz, it's quality of life, but not utopian socialism. So what happened? Why aren't we back in the days of the 1920s, or even the 1950s and 60s, and why did we expand it that way? So I think that there are several factors. And some of them have to do with the kibbutz movement itself and mistakes that they made. One of the biggest mistakes that many kibbutzim did, and the kibbutz movement as a whole made, was in the 1960s, when they decided that agriculture was not enough and that they have to move into industry. And some kibbutzim invested heavily in building factories on kibbutzim. Unfortunately for them, their heritage was in the Soviet Union and not in Western Europe or the United States. So the thinking was Soviet. So they wanted heavy machinery. If you build a factory, make sure that there are big machines. Problem is that those machines cost a lot of money, and if you don't succeed, you're in deep economic trouble. And many of those factories in kibbutzim failed miserably. So they invested millions in infrastructure, and the profits didn't follow. So this led to major economic problems. Back in the 60s, labor was still in control, so they could ultimately bail out the kibbutzim, but the pressures were mounting. Another big change is that in 1977, labor lost the election, and Likud came into power. And all you have to do is listen to some of the political rallies that Menachem Begin held in the run-up to the 1977 election. If you listen to those speeches closely, it's as if he was running against the kibbutz movement. The target were the kibbutzim. And he railed against the funds that were transferred over to the kibbutzim. And again, he would go to the poorest development towns in Israel, where mostly Middle Eastern Jews lived. Those were not accepted by the kibbutzim. And he would tell them, it's hot today, right? You're sweltering under the heat. What are they doing in the kibbutzim? They're on their lawn, jumping into the swimming pool. 1977. And again, you heard about the green grass of the kibbutzim and the swimming pools. Now, he was correct. The kibbutzim did have swimming pools. If you look at the Olympic teams that Israel sent in the 1950s and 60s, the entire swimming team came from kibbutzim. There were no swimming pools elsewhere in Israel. So they were the only ones who knew how to swim, basically. Begin didn't speak about the other sacrifices that they made on the kibbutz, but they became the poster child for the kind of the decadence of the labor movement. And he attacked the kibbutzim. And when he was elected, it was fairly clear that he's not going to help out the kibbutzim. And his government didn't help out the kibbutzim. And again, the kibbutzim did help themselves. The economic reality in Israel in the late 1970s was that the Likud government deregulated and liberalized the Israeli economy and almost overnight transformed it from the socialism of the labor movement into what would become kind of a free market economy. The impact was devastating. And Israel experienced, for a period of about 5-6 years, hyperinflation, triple-digit inflation. Which meant, everyday life, is that if you keep money in the bank, even in a saving account, after a year it's worthless. It was at least 50% of the value of the money. So every citizen in Israel had to become an investor. You had to invest everything in something in order to just maintain the basic value of your money. So what are you going to invest in? Now, there was no separation in Israel between investment banking and regular banking. So you went in to your regular bank branch and bought stocks from the teller. You deposited a check and bought stocks in the same. And they would tell you, well, you can buy all sorts of stocks, but with a wink and a nod, they would say, buy the stocks of our bank. Okay, fine. And they didn't exactly say it, but we'll buy and sell our own stock to make sure that it keeps up with inflation. So everybody was buying bank stocks to make sure that they keep up with inflation. The kibbutzim also had money, right? They needed to do something with it. So Bank Poalim, which was the bank of the Histadrut, told them, buy our bank stock. So they invested tens of millions of dollars in bank stock. Then the regulators in Israel decided to put an end to it in the early 1980s, and they busted the whole bubble. So some of the chiefs of the banks in Israel went to jail. Many, many private citizens lost their life savings. The kibbutz movement was bankrupt. They basically lost everything. And nobody was bailing them out. Some kibbutzim were independently wealthy. Chatzerim, which developed netafim, the drip system, they did marvelous, wonderful. There were kibbutzim, the Golan Heights, with various industries. They were an economic marvel. They did great. They didn't need any bailouts. But the overwhelming majority of the kibbutzim were bankrupt. So what can they do? What's the only thing that they have of any value? What?
Land.
The land, yes. So they basically privatized and sold their land to the members of the kibbutz or to outside factors. Started building hotels and guest houses on their land. And this basically brought an end to the kibbutz as we know it. But Israel as a whole was changing. So in some ways there was nothing surprising. So the kind of state socialism of the Labor Party ended. The Israeli welfare state was falling apart. Other aspects of his legacy was disappearing. And so I would almost say that it was natural that the kibbutz would disappear as well. It was no longer viable, kind of the new Israel, the emerging Israel. And so as a institution that lasted from the 19-teens all the way to the 1970s, it was a noble, incredible experiment. All the other utopian experiments, none of them lasted as long as the kibbutz experiment. So in this regard, it was hugely successful, but in many ways it ended its historic mission by the late 1970s, early 1980s, and over time just disappeared and turned into communities that nowadays try to offer quality of life. And the closer they are to major cities, the better it is for their business, offering this quality of life.
Kibbutz Glilot, for example.
For example, yes, they're sitting on billions of dollars.
Can you say more about that one?
It's a kibbutz literally now in the middle of Herzliya, which is one of the wealthiest suburbs of Tel Aviv. And they own prime land in the middle of Herzliya.
So they started selling, and you buy a small house. In Israel, you mostly live in
Or
buildings, in
leasing,
apartments.
not always selling, but leasing, but potentially they're sitting on billions of dollars.
They made millions.
So maybe I can open it up now for questions.
I'm sitting here and I know a lot of what you've been telling, and the story is the kibbutz movement is pretty well gone. But I'm troubled. The museum here is going to put on an exhibit of the kibbutz. After listening to you, I asked myself a question: why? Why?
There was
Can
no,
you give us,
yeah, I think I told you, there was no other experiment like it.
no, just a minute, just a minute.
Uh-huh.
La'at, la'at. I happen to know enough that I can take care of it. Suppose I were a docent who knew nothing about the kibbutz movement. What positive information should I have so that I can present the story in terms not of its negatives, which I detect is basically the message you gave, in terms of the positives?
Well, I beg to differ. I don't think I gave a negative story. I think what we have is a reality. The kibbutz is no longer. So we know the ending. The ending is not a happy one, but maybe it is a happy one. Maybe it's a sign of the maturity of Israeli society, that it no longer needs utopian forms of settlement. But again, I think that as a social experiment, it's an experiment like no other. No other society was able to create something like the kibbutz. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was the shining symbol of what Zionism was all about, and it was incredibly successful in those years.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
But I'd also, I mean, I think, I'm thinking, taking what Ed's saying, and I think that this is an important question for us to also ask visitors, because I think it's what are the kernels, or what are the ideas that were present in the kibbutz movement and throughout the history of the kibbutz movement that are still important today. So maybe the question that we can ask Professor Kaplan is rather, what do you think is the lasting legacy of the kibbutz?
I'm not sure that there is a lasting legacy. I think that it serves as a historical example of people who were willing to make incredible sacrifices, who were willing to give up their individual wants and needs for the greater good. Maybe not all of society, maybe the greater good meant the kibbutz itself, but they made incredible sacrifices. And
Ideal concept of community,
of
living together,
really
respecting.
giving up your, again, in the most radical way, giving up on your individual needs and wants. I mean, this most basic instinct of wanting to be with your kids all the time. You couldn't do it. The kids were taken away from you. So this was an incredible sacrifice. And we know from reading the diaries of kibbutz members from the very beginning, this was heart-wrenching for them. But they did it because they believed in a higher cause. Maybe today, people in the West, including Israel, no longer believe in a higher cause. It's more difficult. We live in a society that tends to cultivate individualism and gains and so on and so forth. So now Israel is the startup nation where entrepreneurism is celebrated, perhaps not the spirit of the kibbutz. So certainly Israel changed over the years, but they were, I believe, a shining example of what labor Zionism stood for in the 1920s and 1930s. Could it withstand the tide of time? No, it couldn't, because everything around them changed. But it was noble and great as long as it lasted. It was an incredible run.
I was thinking that, I was just wondering, could Israel have been created without the kibbutz movement? From what I'm hearing and what I know of it, I have a feeling it couldn't have happened without that. I mean, it would have been, obviously if it had, we'll never know, but if it had, it would have been a completely different society, but I'm not even sure it could have emerged without it. So, as the foundation of a state, it was essential.
Again, no more than 5% of the population lived on a kibbutz. The overall economic contribution of the kibbutz movement to the overall Israeli economy, or the Jewish economy before 1948, was marginal. The strength of the Jewish community leading up to 1948 were the companies that the Histadrut created, like Solet Boneh, like Nuva. This really provided the infrastructure that allowed Israel to sustain the 1948 war. So the kibbutzim were incredibly helpful, and the spirit of the kibbutzim was very much part of the time, and they provided a very important cultural and ideological boost to the country. As I said, if you saw posters coming out of Palestine in the 1930s, you would imagine that most Jews lived on a kibbutz, because it became a symbol that many people identified with, both within Palestine and outside of Palestine. So I think this was crucial. But for the material well-being of the Jewish community in Palestine, they contributed. They worked very hard. Was it enough, or was it necessary? I don't know. I think that the Zionist movement had many other great achievements that helped it survive 1948. Not to mention factors that had nothing to do with the Zionist movement that were also crucial to explain why it survived 1948.
What did the other 95% think?
What did the other 95% think? Again,
Think of the kibbutz.
Of the kibbutz, most lived in cities. It was the Jewish community in Palestine was urban before the Zionists came and continued to be urban after the Zionists came. Now, the overwhelming majority supported labor up until 1977, and labor very much supported the kibbutz. So they very much identified with the kibbutz. So the kibbutzim was supported by kind of the mainstream of Israeli society. It was when the Likud came to power that this great animosity kind of exploded out there, and was very much targeted as the kibbutz, because again, for Menachem Begin, the kibbutz was a symbol of labor Zionism. So the kibbutz was very much celebrated by the labor movement.
This can be very interesting because the people who we're going to be touring are Americans. We
Mostly.
think of Israel, yeah. We think of Israel because of the propaganda and everything they've done all these years, is with the Sabras. You think of Paul Newman in Exodus. I mean, that's, when I went to the hotel in Jerusalem, I was looking for Paul. Couldn't find him. But I must say, that's what you have coming, that's what's coming here. People like ourselves who are not that educated in the history of the kibbutz. And it is not that big an exhibit, so we're not going to stand in front of it that long. I'm just wondering how much information we're going to give out. I don't know if I would go into the discussion as to why there aren't that many right now, or any of. I would go into what it was, what it did. I certainly will emphasize that it still was a small percentage of the community, of the state. But people are coming here to find out what a kibbutz is, what it was like to live on a kibbutz, and I think that's what we should give them.
But again, notice some of the words that you use. So you said the myth that we have, right? You said the myth of the Sabra. But
the image.
The image of the Sabra.
Yeah,
So what is the Sabra?
right. What is the
What
Sabra?
is the Sabra?
The Sabra is a young
A
person.
native-born Israeli, right?
Oh, yeah.
Native-born
But-
Israeli. But why did they choose the Sabra? What is the Sabra? Technically, what is the Sabra?
If you were in the docent training yesterday,
Yes.
this is your quiz.
The fruit of the cactus, right?
It's a fruit.
Oh,
So,
you're
but
asking
why
specifically.
did they choose the fruit of the cactus to call the Sabra Sabras?
Tough on the outside and soft.
Yeah, but that's what was the reason. But they assumed that it was an indigenous plant, right, of the land, because these were the indigenous sons of Israel, right?
What?
When the Zionists came to Palestine in the
Non-native
1880s,
plant.
they saw sabras all around them, cacti with fruit. They assumed that it was indigenous. So they called their children sabras because they were children of the land, fruit of the land. But there's a hitch in the story. Because where do cacti come from?
Africa.
New Mexico, not the Middle East. They were brought in the 1820s and 1830s.
So they're transplants just like everybody else.
Exactly.
Still works.
So even the image of the sabra, the name itself is based on complicated history. So everything is based on complicated history. You can't just wash it away. I'll give you another perspective to look at. There's some interesting works of art coming out by people who grew up on kibbutzim. We have books and movies done by people who were born on a kibbutz. If you look at them, trust me, you are not going to show them in tandem with the exhibit here. They offer devastating look at what life on the kibbutz was. Look at Lina Meshutefet, communal sleep, a documentary on growing up in a kibbutz. It's an indictment against the kibbutz movement and what they did to kids by taking them away from their parents. Sweet Mud, an Israeli film from 2006, is a devastating look at the sexual perversity on the kibbutz and the impact on kids. And again, these are works of art by people who grew up on a kibbutz. I did not grow up in a kibbutz, so I don't have those things. So again, you have so many perspectives. Ultimately, you have to synthesize those various perspectives and decide the story that you want to
I
tell.
think that if this exhibit was in,
raised her hand so many
Me
times.
too.
Only saying.
Wait, Joan, did you have one closing?
I was just gonna say, if this was in where the Ginsburg is, then I think we could go into more detail, but this is right over here in the showcase. It's not that big.
Okay, Barbara.
My question is, you say there's no kibbutz, but there are entities that
Yes.
consider themselves.
They call
kibbutz.
themselves kibbutz, but again, they don't live up to those principles that govern the kibbutz.
But they evolve just like everything else evolves.
Absolutely,
And to
yes.
say that there's no kibbutz may not be accurate.
Yes,
because
you're right.
The
There-
kibbutz is just different than a kibbutz.
It's very different, yes. I meant that we don't have the kibbutz in the way that it used to be. It's not your father's or grandfather's
Right,
kibbutz.
I mean, I have very good friends with them.
Yes, it's
Their
still
children
called.
are staying on the kibbutz.
Yes, but again, it's not this utopian socialist experiment. There's private
They're
property.
also stuck because they have no money to.
Some, yes,
Higher.
some kibbutz members, you're absolutely right, suffer greatly because of this transition into capitalism. Because they have nothing to leave their kids. Because the idea, if you grew up in a kibbutz in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you didn't need to think of an inheritance for your kids. They just became kibbutz members, and they were guaranteed employment and housing and being taken care of. Nowadays in Israel, nothing is guaranteed. You need to leave something for the next
Well, at
generation.
least they're covered. They will have retirement there as long as this entity exists.
Well,
Well,
and then-
Social Security may go away too.
yes, no, but we know of many cases in those kibbutzim that still exist. Of the older generation was suffering economically. They basically have nothing to leave for their kids, who then want to leave, explore life elsewhere, and they're starting way behind as opposed to in comparison to other Israelis from an urban background. So, just, again, the changing reality. And for some of the older kibbutz members, they live in a reality now that they have to take care of things they never imagined that they would have to negotiate. Buying extra health insurance, who would have imagined that it would be part of Israeli life?
Even paying rent.
Yes.
Where from?
Food, all those.
I'd like to put something forward. I think there's, we talk about an individual society here in the United States, and I think there's a lot of, for a period of time, there's been a lot of fear around like organized living, and we've seen like the failure of communism. We've seen what happened in China. It's finally come out. So there's what used to be an idealist outlook became this kind of fear of being controlled, right? But now we're living in capitalism, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so then there's this reaching on some level for a way of looking after other people.
Yes.
Like, okay, so this isn't working. So, I think I wonder, I guess, just looking at the model of the kibbutz,
Yes.
because it, in some level, was an idealistic model that did
absolutely
still
right.
have
Yes.
those
Yeah.
abuses that
Yes.
occur everywhere, and
Yes.
anything that you could call.
I fully agree with you, and I think it's a great point. So kind of, we have this.
So what can we pull, I guess
What
is
can
the
we-
question.
So there are
that
young
can
people in
help us
Israel,
out in
there are
looking
young
towards
people in
the
Israel who
future.
are trying to pull.
Yeah.
So we have this new wave of urban kibbutzim, of young idealistic Israelis who go into rough neighborhoods in the cities and move into those neighborhoods, trying to create new social networks that draw from kind of the spirit of the kibbutz. It's not all kibbutz. We're trying to bring the spirit into kind of the urban environment. So, for example, one of the leaders of the social protests of 2011 was the president of the Israeli Student Union at the time. He lives in Lod, which is one of the poorest cities in Israel, and he's engaged in one of those projects. So part of his social protest, trying to rehabilitate some of the old social networks in Israel, meant moving into those neighborhoods and building what now they call urban kibbutzim. Again, it's not the kibbutz of the 1920s and 1930s. It's very much within a reality of a much changed Israel. But it's the idea that you can bring some of the spirit, some of the values into the city and try to resist perhaps some of the impact that capitalism, the free market, brought to Israel.
I've been waiting to ask a question.
Hmm?
Can I just ask a question, please? You're
So, but did I address your concern in, so this is one place where you can hear maybe the legacy of the kibbutz in the 21st century, of the traditional kibbutz.
Well, other than not the removal of private
Mhm.
ownership
Uh-huh.
and sacrifice,
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying is the spiritual ideal of the woods. I remember people coming back
Mhm.
who I've spoken to in the last 10 years who get really excited about going there, but I
Going
don't
where, to where?
go.
Volunteers, it was everyone from here, and I think
Who
that's
were
what we're going
volunteers?
to get a lot of our visitors. People
Like
that went
spent
as
6 months on the
volunteers to
kibbutz.
Yes.
kibbutzim,
Right.
worked for 3 weeks,
Right.
had a great time.
Yeah.
But they
Nice
didn't
pool,
see
too.
the blood and
They
the
didn't.
you know,
It
the
was-
heart.
They were on kind of a working vacation.
Right, so I'm just at, what are those ideals, like, that we're getting at? What are, because I guess I hear, okay, that we're working in a group,
Mhm.
okay, we're taking care of, but I'm also hearing, like, nobody gets to be an individual, which doesn't sound like an ideal, it sounds
No,
negative.
but you give up.
So,
You
what-
give up
what are you
consumer,
getting
you
from
give
it?
up consumerism, you give up certain desires that you have, you give up. It's a question of realization. Where do you find yourself? I'll give you another example.
And we'll get to you,
anecdote.
Ellen, I promise.
And then, so I told you that in the 1950s and 1960s, if you looked at the elite units in the IDF, pilots or commando units, about 50% were kibbutz. If you look at the same units today, over 50% come from where? Settlements in the West Bank. The settlers. And part of the ideology of some of the settlers in the West Bank is that they're saying we are the true kibbutzniks of the 21st century because we are giving up on our individual desires for a higher ideal. For them, it's the settlement of the West Bank and making sure that it remains under Israel's sovereignty. I would say that there are some differences between their form of ideology and what was practiced in the 1920s and 1930s, but maybe this is, but they claim that they are the true heirs of the second Aliyah and the pioneers of the kibbutz.
And I want to bookmark what Daisy's asking, and when we get to Ellen's question, come back to this bigger question of the legacy of the kibbutz, and because I think some of the questions are questions that aren't necessarily about the kibbutz itself, but are about this exhibition and how are we framing it for these two exhibitions. So let's pause that for a second. Let's get to Ellen's question, and then let's come back to that because that's also a conversation that, you know, Professor Kaplan has not been involved in curating this exhibition. Maybe Dan can come in on that conversation. We can have a little bit of an open discussion about that. So it's an important point.
So my question is this: in my research, you're probably familiar with the kibbutz. It's like, 2 miles away from Camp Newman. Yes, no? Camp, Kibbutz Yarak, they call it Oki.
Kibbutz Yarok.
Here in California.
Here in
It's
California.
right here in
It's part of a,
California.
a Jewish
okay.
summer camp.
Okay, and the Federation has invested millions of dollars so that people, whether they be kids or adults, would have this kibbutz experience. And so I'm really wondering if this is the only one in the United States, or if, others like this, to teach values, to teach, what it was like then, to bring kids closer to their Judaism, which all, I think, are very positive. So when I hear that there are no more kibbutzim, I really don't know where that comes from. I also don't know if around the country something similar is developing. So I really think if you don't know that it's there, you might want to take your students on a field trip just so they know that, that
But it's not a kibbutz.
But it's not a real
But it's
kibbutz.
not a
it is
kibbutz.
practicing. I mean, the kids are.
It doesn't sustain itself, though.
And
It's
they
there
don't
as
live
an
there
educational-
forever. It's educational center
It's an
in the
educational
model of
center.
a kibbutz.
It's a model of a kibbutz, but it's not a kibbutz.
Well, they call it kibbutz. That's how they
No, no.
bill it.
The name is fine.
That's almost the
But,
point.
but the idea of a kibbutz was that you went and lived. This was your life. You didn't go there for 3 weeks and then came back.
So, but I
You
guess
gave
what
up
I'm saying is
everything.
that there's still a value that, that it was valuable to live on a kibbutz, and that the values that came out of there, are still, grounded and, let me see what I mean. In my mind, that is still, a current example of a kibbutz. And when I hear that there's, no more kibbutz, I'm hearing from them that, friends or family or whatever have been on a kibbutz for 6 months. So I'm really confused in terms of, what are the kibbutz that are still in existence now? I guess that's what I'm asking.
So I'm going to jump in and clarify, because I think what was said was that the kibbutz model, the ideal kibbutz model with no ownership, with total communal living, total this structure, that traditional kibbutz structure does not exist. But as Barbara mentioned, and as Daisy mentioned, there are organizations that are called kibbutzim that are in Israel. We have examples in the exhibition of the kibbutz that teaches permaculture, and there's a kibbutz that has solar fields. So there are kibbutzim in existence, but they're not the, I would say, kibbutz with a capital K,
It's not
if
this
you will.
utopian socialist model that existed for so many years.
So that's, I think we're on a little bit of a technicality here. But I think also what you're saying, Ellen, is there has to be something that is so compelling about that kibbutz model, that original kibbutz model, for a Reformed Jewish summer camp in California to have something they call a kibbutz as part of their educational structure. So that's the question, is getting at what that is. And I think that's what our Utopia exhibit is really thinking about. It's these 3 artists wrestling with what is Utopia? What does it look like, and is it attainable? Because we look at the kibbutz model of Utopia, and it was attained for just a brief moment, and it doesn't exist in that sort of pure utopian form. So wrestling with those questions of what is utopia and what do we want to hold on to from that kibbutz legacy. There are models, you mentioned co-ops, you're thinking of the New York co-op, but there's co-housing in Berkeley. There's still people in this country, particularly in this region, working on communal living, collective living. How can we collaborate? And I also see it in communities. We talked a little bit about this at the docent training. People who are trying to reject a little bit of our individualistic capitalist society to hold on, not in this sort of throw away all your possessions and live completely communally, but how are we kind of going back to a more communal lifestyle?
And to add to that, there's a lot of gardening and agriculture that's done in that way. Neighborhoods,
Yes, but again,
taken from.
but if you think of the kibbutz, you need to make this radical departure from the rest of society. It was a major commitment that you had to forfeit everything. You couldn't keep a bank account on the outside when you joined the kibbutz.
You couldn't make your own decision. Someone had to You know, the committee made the decision for you. If you're going to study, what you're going to
So
study.
it wasn't just communal gardening, where you go for a few hours a
No, I
week.
understand.
This was your life.
No, I do understand.
And every second of your life was part. So the kibbutz became your consuming
That's
identity.
not a good call. So going back to Ed's question,
Uh-huh.
you know, what do we say that's positive? I feel sort of depressed.
There was a lot of
I think
teamwork.
I think it's incredible. I look at those people, I look at them with awe. I mean, this is incredible what they did, the type of sacrifice that they made, the type of things that they were able to achieve. It's incredible. I'm very sad that society as a whole changed, that we have no room for that anymore. But,
Yeah.
but as I tried to tell you, it's a bigger story. I mean, Israel as a whole changed. And so the kibbutz, it couldn't resist those changes. They were just overwhelming, so they had to succumb. The political changes were just too great, too big.
Dan, do you want to add something from a curatorial perspective?
Yeah, I do. This has been, thank you so much. It's been really great to hear these details and to hear these conversations. And I know this isn't the first conversation that you've all had about the kibbutz and what it means. So I want to go back, Rabbi Zerin, I understood your question from some time ago to be asking really about why does this institution want to have an exhibition about kibbutz and why this particular exhibition. I think that's your question, right? Why are we doing it? And so just going all the way back to 3 or 4 points that I think maybe it's useful to bring back to the surface for a moment, at least from my perspective, is that one, it's an exhibition that gives some historical grounding to understand more about the exhibition on utopia and art. So there's an aspect of that if you want to understand certainly 2 of these artists and also the ideas of utopia in some kind of Jewish framework, you kind of have to understand something about the kibbutz experiment. So that's something that's useful. I think that the vitrine here, as we all know, is a place where the museum has an opportunity to talk about one aspect of what the Jewish experience has been, whether it's Bay Area Jewish life initially, and then the Seidowitz exhibition with ritual objects. And this is an opportunity to talk about this really extraordinary period in Jewish life, in Israeli life, which was kind of the kibbutz. So it's an opportunity to go into that story. I think that the third piece is where some of the I won't say conflict, but where we're kind of in this conversation more deeply now is about whether the kibbutz exists or doesn't exist. Did it stop? Has it evolved? And I think that's some of the semantics of our conversation. And I think that from the curatorial point of view, I think the way that we're expressing it is that there was this period of kind of the classical kibbutz, and that's evolved into something else, a kind of a kibbutz 2.0, which there are maybe some classical kibbutzim that still exist, but most of them have changed with the times, and that's interesting. And so I don't think that Professor Kaplan is saying that because there's been this significant change that the experiment was, it ended, it was a failure, but it's not negative. I don't think that he was expressing it as negative. So I think that the way that I talk about it and the way that I hope that we'll all talk about it is that it was this extraordinary experiment and that it's changed, and we still have a lot to learn from what happened. And that's the fourth piece, I think, which is looking at the ways in which Jewish life in America was influenced by the kibbutz, whether it's kind of the symbol of the kibbutzim with the Jewish National Fund, or whether it's something like Kibbutz Yarok at the camp, where there's a sense that the kibbutz model and those ideals still animate something important about what it means to be part of a community, and that especially at this moment in time, there's a sense of going back to the land, a kind of, there's a DIY aesthetic to the kibbutzim where they make things themselves and they're working with available materials and recycling, however we want to talk about that now. That there's something still fresh and exciting and influential about the kibbutz model, even though the classical kibbutz model no longer exists. Does that help a little bit in terms of?
That's the way I think we have to tour it.
So those are, I guess, like the 4 pieces that are in my mind. this is a small digression. A friend of mine just came back from Burning Man, who spent a year on a kibbutz, and he said something, I can't remember his exact phrase, I think he was still coming off his high, but it was something like being on a kibbutz through a cracked mirror of some metaphor, something, but it was interesting about the Burning Man where, you know, you're not allowed to, there's no money and you don't own anything, and I mean, this really is not a kibbutz, people don't live there, it's this crazy vacation, but there was some aspect of that idealism that for him was still connected to being on a kibbutz 20 years ago.
And I think, Dan, what the key word that I think you just said was idealism. There was this idealism within the kibbutz movement, and that pervades is pervasive in other areas of society. And I think that's each of the three artists in the work in progress is thinking about this idealism and wrestling with that. Is it possible? So I think we also can't think of this exhibition on its own. I think this exhibition is always, well, until the other one closes, but it's always in conversation with work in progress, Staging Utopia, and that title is really deliberate. It's a work in progress, and what does that mean? And it's staging utopia. We've got a stage in there, but it's something it's a model. It's being worked on. It's being created. Is it possible? So thinking about those two and the interplay between those two exhibitions, I think, is going to be important.
What in the world isn't a work in progress? How many civilizations have come and gone
Yeah.
and considered very successful that don't exist anymore? Why? Is there something wrong with them? Well, times change.
Our own democracy has changed from 1776.
Were you around then?
I remember it well.
Poor Jill.
This
Okay,
right here.
Daisy.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up Burning Man because to me, it's a model of radical individualism where people are looking out for each other, you know, in a sense.
Radical individualism?
Yes, Burning Man. I mean, people come in with their own
They're not
concept
wearing
of
the
what
same clothes.
they get to pick what they bring, they get to pick
Right.
how they bring it, they get to choose how they're going there.
Right.
But you must bring something for the common good. You have to. You have to either
Everybody has to
bring
work, you
an
have to volunteer.
experience, you have to bring water for other people, you have to set up shelf, you have to bring extra, you have to help. You have to help. And it's what you bring to it. It's a model of what you bring. Burning Man is what you bring to it. It's not an audience experience. It's a participatory experience. So it's interesting that you bring it up because it's definitely like a contemporary concept of utopia, even if people are only living there for a month or 2 months. The other thing that just came up for me is just my other major, other than art, was anthropology, and there were a lot of the same discussions around anthropology about this society was so perfect, and then it fell apart. Like, we looked at whatever it is, this Native American group in this pure form, and now they walk around in jeans, and it's ruined, but they're still practicing, but it doesn't really mean, like, a lot of this stuff comes up, I guess, around that, this idea of a pure system, but it's still there. There's still, people still in the changing world, like, try to find what it is in that place that they can bring to the present, and I think that's worth looking at no matter what, even if those purities can't, a lot of times purity, in a global society, you just can't take these separate, small, you can't, and a lot of times utopian models haven't succeeded unless they are separate or small, so it's interesting to. Exactly, I think all those discussions are worthy, are real, are all the issues that we have.
I had one more little point about this whole thing of kibbutz versus utopia. Maybe it was a utopia for a brief period, but maybe it was just a brief period that was a utopia, and maybe all utopias are just very short. So that's an interesting question for this exhibit is what is utopia, and how does it relate to kibbutzim, and then how does time influence all this? Is it a short period? making it seem for a long period, but maybe they weren't really.
Well, we have two prominent critiques of utopia, let's say the socialist communism. One is the liberal critique, and especially after the Second World War, this became the prominent critique of utopia, is that utopia is dangerous, because the real outcome of utopia is dictatorship.
Is what?
It's dictatorship, or totalitarian regimes. So you can play with utopia, but at the end you're going to get Stalin or Hitler. So that's the liberal critique. Then you have the leftist critique, which, for example, in the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels are very critical of the utopian socialism. And they said, look, you're naive. You're playing with small groups, but you don't realize that we're in an advanced capitalist society, where the forces are so big that you have to focus on a revolution that addresses all of society. So what you're doing, you're playing games, they're meaningless. 200, 300 people, yeah, take care of them. But you're not providing a universal answer. So you have those two kind of critiques of utopia. So nowadays, very few people would describe themselves as utopians. It's kind of an adjective that people try to stay away from.
And we're also talking both about socialism and utopia, which are not the same, you know. So kibbutz was a socialist model, a socialist utopian
Who's
model.
there,
So.
utopia?
Pardon me?
Who's there, utopia?
Yeah. Last questions for Professor Kaplan, for Dan, to put out to the group. This is this tour training is a work in progress, so this will not be the last time we discuss this. We have several more weeks, so don't fear. But any last comments, questions? You don't fear? Good. Neither do
I told Segal that.
I. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Sharing your knowledge.